A very warm welcome, everyone. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor-at-large at Reuters, and I'm thrilled to be back as the host for this energy series. Today's webinar, Natural Gas, Security of Demand in a Greener World, is, as always, hosted by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with the London Stock Exchange Group Data and Analytics. A few very brief words to set the context here. I'm sure little of this will be news to our audience today, but here goes anyway. The oil and gas sector, which provides more than half of global energy supply and employs nearly 12 million workers worldwide, currently accounts for just 1% of clean energy investment globally. And as the rise of clean energy shrinks fossil fuel demand, oil and gas producers have little choice but to become, of course, part of the solution. As a cleaner hydrocarbon, natural gas has already replaced coal and liquid fuel as the primary source of electricity in many countries. However, for gas to be a credible transitional fuel, it is critical to accelerate the decarbonization of the gas industry. This, of course, includes addressing methane, which is responsible for almost a third of global emissions, and is something we will talk about in this webinar. Yes, it would be foolhardy to overlook the dire consequences of reducing gas supply too rapidly, given that it accounts for a quarter of global generation. With power consumption expected to triple by 2050, and with the global population projected to grow by about 1.7 billion by the same year, the energy transition, of course, needs careful planning to avoid exposing industries and populations to energy shortages. So that is our backdrop. A few housekeeping bits before we start. For the best viewing experience, do read the instructions above the media player. For any technical issues, refresh the page or reach out via issuerservices@lseg.com. Any questions for our panel, and please do send your questions through and start doing that as soon as possible. Click on Ask a Question. And just finally, a recording of this session will be available using the same event link. Right. Let me introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to come to the first polling question, which we would like your views on. Agnieszka Asson is senior visiting research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Massimo Di Odoardo is vice president, head of global gas content at Wood Mackenzie. Trevor Sikorsky is head of global gas and emissions at Energy Aspects, and Yan Qin is lead carbon analyst at the London Stock Exchange Group. A warm welcome to all of you. Just before I come to you, let me throw the first polling question out there. We'll give you some time to respond to that, and I'll bring you the results of that. So if we could put that polling question up on the screens, the first one: what will be the role of natural gas in the evolving energy landscape? Will it be as a bridge fuel to a low-carbon future until the world achieves its net zero targets? Or will it be with us for a while yet as a critical and irreplaceable component of a reliable energy system? We'll let you have a crack at that. But in the meantime, and I'll bring you those results shortly, but in the meantime, let me go to our speakers. And Massimo, I want to kick it off with you, if I could. Is it fair to say, Massimo, that there has been and this is clearly a very important part of the context, but a noticeable softening of ambition, of energy transition ambition, and that this is going to change the way some people see the role both of oil and gas, but coal too, as we move forward?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. We've gone through a period of substantial security of supply concerns following the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis that has emerged out of that. And inevitably, governments have had to prioritize security of supply ahead of energy transition. And as a consequence, we've seen some policies softening in many markets. But at the same time, investment in renewables globally have kept increasing, right? I mean, obviously there are spots that are brighter than others, and certainly some countries, including China, but also India, have seen investment in renewables also as a way to improve security of supply. And at the same time, we're coming off a period now where as gas and LNG prices, and to some extent oil prices, and certainly oil prices have come down substantially to the very high level that we've seen over the last few years. We're also seeing a shift back into other consideration apart from security of supply. I mean, make no mistake, security of supply following the last couple of years has certainly improved substantially in the agenda of everybody and governments, globally. But certainly, as prices come down, we should be seeing hopefully a refocus on some of the ambitions in terms of achieving. Trying to get closer to those targets, which are very ambitious, obviously, but certainly a pathway to get to get to a greener world.
Yeah, and I do a little bit later want to talk about which low carbon energy opportunities can offer the sorts of returns that shareholders are seeing now. 15% plus returns that they're seeing now from fossil fuel. We'll come back to that. But Jan, let me come to you. China, as Massimo was saying, clearly an important piece of this discussion. Give us a sense of when you think China will ever put gas meaningfully into its power sector, or whether you think we're just going to leapfrog in China from coals straight to renewables. How's that going to work?
Thank you, Axel. So we already begin with talking about elephant in the room, China, both in terms of its energy consumption, also China's role in energy transition. Well, zooming in really, let's say gas accounts for less than 10% of China's total energy consumption. And basically why? Because China don't have much domestic production. And then secondly, in terms of power sector, as you're asking, well, gas share is just slightly above 5% of China's total power generation, where coal is still the dominant fuel, and renewables, solar and wind additions are quickly ramping up as well. And last year was a record year for solar capacity additions in China, and we are likely to see another 200 gigawatts installed this year. Well, thanks to the vast manufacturing base, but also exactly reflecting what Massimo had said. After the war, it's reinforced not only the thinking that, well, coal or Chinese domestic coal provides supply energy security, but renewables. A rooftop solar also provides energy security. So I think with that, I can say that in a way, my view is that it's more likely with China's, let's say, power sector decarbonization, it will more likely to leapfrog from coal to renewables, as we can already see the trend from last 2 years. On the other hand, I do notice that if we look at data of gas installed capacity additions, in the past 2 years, it's actually beating my expectations based on the paper I wrote actually for Oxford Institute for Energy Studies on China's gas power sector. So the current installed gas capacity, 136 gigawatt, is above what I have predicted 2 years ago. And I looked into the reason and why. It is because one major reason behind the rapid growth of gas power installed capacity is the need for balancing power to accompany the renewables growth. So I think this to keep power system in balance in the near to medium term, will sort of support the role of gas in China's power system, but not massively. So yeah. I think my conclusion is a more steady growth and eventually replaced by renewables plus storage.
Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed, Jan. Look, just before we get to Agnieszka and Trevor, I'm going to bring you the results of this first poll because we've had those through now. I don't think it's any great surprise here. The role of natural gas in the evolving energy landscape, 20% of the audience have picked A. So bridge fuel to low carbon future until the world achieves its net zero targets. 80% for B. It's going to be with us for a while yet. As a critical and irreplaceable component of a reliable energy system. I don't know if that fits well, Massimo, with the question I asked you, this softening of energy transition ambition, but it seems to. But that's the response to that first poll. Agnieszka, I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise that. I mean, we'll come on in a second to how this is reflected in sales transactions and gas contracts. But generally, are you surprised by the result of that?
No, not at all. Gas will remain a vital part of the energy system, also due to the fact that so many contracts have been signed that go up until or even beyond 2050. So I think the poll question was provocative in a sense, whether 2050 is a cutoff date for gas being a tradable commodity. Certainly it is not, and I think the audience got it right, that we'll have gas available for much longer than that. The difference will be that gas will be in a much more diversified landscape. And this means that there will be decarbonized gas and LNG transactions through emissions reduction measures, through carbon offsets. So those will be premium offerings on the market. Gas will also function along hydrogen value chain. And there's also scope for green gases. There is scope for e-methane, emerging international value chain. So in short, a much more diversified landscape. So an international gas contract of the future will be a very different thing to what we have today.
Is just very quickly on the back of that, is the demand for chemical products, Agnieszka, do you think, derived from natural gas sufficient to stabilize the demand for gas as the demand for electricity declines?
Well, so in terms of demand drivers, that all depends when and where. And generally, the strongest demand for gas will come from Asia. The decarbonizing China will be a strong driver for that demand too. Whether it will be the chemical sector, the power sector, other industrial applications, and so on, that again depends on a particular context. But there is a lot of scope for the need for gas, and this is something what I think we can all agree on this panel.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Agnieszka. And Trevor, I want to come to you again, a broad position on gas, what the transition means for gas first up, and then maybe you could just give us a sense of what you think will drive the bulk of gas demand through 2050. I guess which sector, and our second poll also asked that question, which I'll come to in a moment.
Yeah, thank you, Axel. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to echo a lot of it, I guess, what the other panelists were saying. But when you look at, you look at gas and you look at how it's going to go, yes, it's going to be important. And we are in a very odd place in terms of where we've got to with transition. And I think, you are looking at, certainly during 2022, the one thing probably we were investing heavily in globally, both in Europe and in China and in a bunch of other places, was of course renewables, because thermal became so expensive and we lived through this massive kind of energy shock, which we're just coming out at the end of. But what the energy shock did, it kind of embedded inflation into the economies, and that has made transition more expensive and more difficult. You've got higher rates, got a lot of higher input costs. All of these things are about costs, and the transition was going to be expensive anyways. And now it's just seen as much, much more expensive. And so that is going to kind of slow it. And I would guess the other point is 2050, the world doesn't have, in theory or in practice, I should say, a net zero target by 2050. Certain places have that. Certainly, most of the OECD probably has that. But you look at China, the net zero is 2060. You look at India, the net zero is 2070, right? So we're not, even with government targets, we aren't heading for net zero by 2050. So the role of gas is going to be, around for a long time. And because it is lower carbon than things like coal, even just replacing coal creates a massive amount of opportunity for, and potential market for gas. Now, I think, as Jan, pointed out, maybe the Chinese, certainly security of supply is important, and they have a lot of coal, and they have a big coal, manufacturing industry. So getting gas into something for them probably as important as power looks, it probably will be, as Jan was saying, more on the kind of balancing component. But I think even in Europe, you would see, sectorally, if we are successful in decarbonizing a lot of industry, that means a lot of hydrogen. It means a lot of electrolytic hydrogen. And you mentioned it in your opening, Axel, that, we do expect power to become way more, way bigger in terms of its share of energy and how much energy as we put, as we electrify transport, as we electrify industry, as we electrify hydrogen, all of these things, just putting a lot of pressure on the power sector. And you will need something that is able to balance, all of those demands with a very, with supply, which is not always baseload, which is very variable, which, comes and goes. And that kind of balancing is very difficult. I don't think we even have the technologies for balancing across seasons. And if you put a lot of heating requirements into power, which, is what heat pumps does, another one of the key transition technologies, then you are looking at, some pretty seasonal power, power patterns. Yes, you have a bit of seasonality in wind, you have counter seasonality in solar. So all of these things, are going to be super challenging, and gas will have that role of just getting us through a lot of those challenges, because one, we do expect it to get, certainly over the next 4 or 5 years, we expect it to get cheaper. And two, there's just a lot of things which will require flexibility, and gas gives you that.
Just Massimo, to bring you back in, I'm going to stay on the big picture now, and maybe it's slightly political, this question, but do you think the public is being misled on realistic climate goals? And I wonder what the value in that is. Is there a financial risk exposure in acknowledging that we won't meet 1.5 degrees, for example? Is that an unfair question?
I mean, certainly, when those targets were set, right, we're in a very different, climate and energy environment. Again, you need to kind of go back before the energy crisis that came out of the war, and I think to Trevor's point, we were certainly also in a situation of much lower interest rates. So I think, certainly, it was important to set ambitious targets, to set the way in terms of the the effort required across different governments to try and deliver on some of these ambitions, right? So I wouldn't say it's necessarily been wrong. Then obviously things have changed, and we've gone through the crisis that we've talked about, and I think now it's fair to say that there's a pretty strong dose of realism in terms of just how challenging some of those targets are. And you see governments, including an institution, including the European Commission and Union, being more realistic about some of these and eventually tracking down in terms of some of these targets. I mean, is it has the public been tricked? I think you need to be ambitious if you set up these targets, right? If you're not ambitious, you're never going to get there, right? But I think now is a good time to get that dose of realism and for governments and institutions to work together to try to achieve what's possible.
Okay. Agnieszka, let me bring you in on this as well. Again, I don't want to make this too political, but who's getting, do you think, the balance right when it comes to policy decisions? Who's leading the pack on energy efficiency? Would you say it's Europe?
So Europe is typically seen to be at the forefront of regulation of decarbonization requirements, but there's a lot of regulatory incentive available already in Asia, and there is policy support at a great scale that is available to both gas, hydrogen, renewable, all types of infrastructure that can accelerate decarbonization in many places across the world. So yes, so to answer your question directly, Europe is typically seen as the primary reference point, but the others are doing a lot too. So altogether, it's a global effort. This is, of course, a challenge for anyone trading gas or LNG across the globe to be in compliance with all of those new emerging regulations. But that's the new reality of regulation being an important part of the business.
Sure. And Jan, how would you characterize China's position on energy efficiency and how it's getting on?
Yes, we're moving to Agnieszka's view on the EU being the forefront, and to China, that's really the other end, where not regulation, but administrative measures, rules. Despite I'm an energy market analyst, I'm very pro market and cost efficient ways. But no, with China, they boast that with market-based mechanism are only starting in carbon market, power market, gas market. So what's China's policymakers thinking in terms of pushing forward decarbonization? I mean, the carbon neutrality goal for 2060 is still there, and there are renewed assurance from the top leadership that China stick to it. Because why? For China's own interest to transform its own energy-intensive manufacturing to more competitiveness in green technology manufacturing of China. So on that, I think exactly for energy efficiency in Chinese policymaker NDRC's term, it's energy savings or energy conservation. Where only last week the state planner has issued a new plan to push forward the effort to save energy and reduce carbon as well for 2024 and 2025 with very detailed plan on the industries. When I say it's plan, it's again more administrative measures, but that's at the moment is seen as more effective in driving down energy consumption or excess energy consumption and reduce capacity in certain industry sectors. So I think this is what we can observe. But as for more new investment, that's the retrofitting, etc., that's costly, which seems to be a bit hard at the moment, given the whole macroeconomic outlook. So I would say a wait and see mode on that.
Okay, let me come to the second poll, and then I want to talk about the technology and the efficiency and arbitrage that offers consumers. The second poll, if we could put that one up, which sectors are going to drive the bulk of gas demand through 2050? We touched on this a little bit, but you've got 6 choices here, from the power sector down to iron and steel, heat generation, and primary industries. And again, I'll come to that in a second. But actually, Trevor, let me throw that to you. Which sector do you think will drive the bulk of demand?
I think probably you'll see a lot. It depends where you are, and I think in emerging Asia, it is probably going to be industry. So there's an awful lot of work to do in both China and India, probably just getting gas into industry, one of the easiest places to get it into. I think power will come though, and I think it's just because the expansion of power and the expansion of power demand that we expect is going to need an awful lot of kind of thermal backup to get it going, and gas is probably the most palatable and probably the most economic of the options that are out there that will deliver emission reductions. And you'll get pretty big emission reductions just by closing down coal-fired power generation and putting in gas. But the problem, I think, in 2 of the world's biggest economies, which of course the Indian one and the Chinese one, coal is seen as a domestic fuel, right? And they both have gas as domestic fuels, but certainly, it will be hard for gas to push out a lot of domestic coal in either of those markets. But generally, I would say certainly, there is going to be such a big role for power that we shouldn't underplay the kind of role I think gas has for the power sector going forward.
Yeah, would you go with that? Trevor's thoughts on power, Massimo?
Yeah, I think I think certainly India and China are the most difficult ones, right? But it's interesting to think about Southeast Asia as a market, because that's a market where obviously electricity demand is growing substantially. And if you exclude Indonesia, there is moratorium on building new coal plants everywhere you look at those markets, right? And obviously, private capital to deliver additional coal plants, even if the moratorium was not in place, would be very hard to get. So on one side, you have very strong GDP growth, you've got very strong electricity demand, and certainly renewable is going to be at the front end of how those countries invest. But if you don't build coal, you cannot just replace all of that increasing electricity demand just with renewables. And so gas, we think, is going to play a pretty important role in those markets. Obviously, there are very differences across markets, right? So, Malaysia and Indonesia have, quite strong domestic production, and obviously they've got exports, but some of the growth that they anticipate in demand could be supported by their domestic production, certainly until they become, for the time that they remain self-sufficient. You've got Singapore, where maybe demand is not going to grow much, but certainly, reduction in domestic production pays well for LNG imports. And then you've got Philippines and Vietnam, where actually, there are very strong plans in place to develop additional CCGT plans. They're probably too ambitious. It's hard to see how they can deliver on these plans. But again, if you have a power demand that is increasing so strongly as it is in those markets, and you cannot build additional coal, gas remains the best option to achieve those targets, right? So we're actually very positive also about the role of gas in power market. I mean, it's very different across market, as Trevor was saying, right? But certainly, in some markets, we see a big role of gas in the power sector as well.
Yeah. What do you think, Axel, specifically in relation to this poll question?
Yeah, so I agree with what Trevor and Massimo have just said. Industrial applications and power. So the two key drivers, at least in Asia, power certainly in Southeast Asia. And the role of gas as stabilizing the grid, very important here. So yeah, industrial applications and power.
Okay. And look, yeah. Sorry to interrupt, Axel. And look, we've got a result through for that, and option A, power, comes in at 38%. Second is hydrogen and other sustainable fuel production at 25%. I don't know if you can put those results up on the screen, but so we got power at 38, hydrogen and other sustainables at 25%. I want to talk a little bit about some of the technologies, and then we'll come to the sort of returns you think we can get on these. But Jan, can I start with you on this? That the role that technology increasingly plays in offering consumers efficiency and arbitrage, choice, I guess. What excites you most, Jan?
Well, I have a very short answer: the sustainable fuel production. Because we are aiming as respondents, and actually our panel agree with the uptake in power sector. But on technology, when I say that outside the power sector, the reduction effort in other sectors, in some industrial sectors and in transport sectors, it's where you can't electrify, then you rely on sustainable fuels. So either hydrogen-based or biofuels. So I think that excites me most, as I am a carbon analyst. I do hope for more climate action, as bring the world closer to a climate goal or less warming. So I'm very excited about more technology breakthroughs in bringing down the cost of sustainable fuels and make it more widely utilized.
Okay, and you're including here the aviation, sustainable aviation fuels, etc., etc.
Yes.
I don't want to be the voice of doom, or at least play too much devil's advocate here, but the sustainable aviation fuel story has been running for a while, and it's got a ways to go. No,
that's what we need: technological breakthrough.
And you remain optimistic on that, do you?
Yes. I think that we've tracked how fast the cost of solar panels and battery packs has gone down, I believe. And now we have exciting AI. Technology will only become better and better.
Okay. Be good to get the other speakers' views. Yeah. Trevor, let's start with you. I mean, excuse me, and I throw in there, building fabrics, equipment, energy control, AI-enabled intelligent systems, electrification, all of that. What excites you most, Trevor?
Good question. I mean, when we look at what's difficult, right? Probably big transport's difficult, right? So you're looking at shipping, you're looking at aviation, really, really hard stuff. And, you know, the way the world's going is going to be things like SAF, it's drop-in fuels, it's that type of thing. And then if you do that, then you have a big reliance on hydrogen. Now, I think it's interesting that people are saying hydrogen's probably, you know, where they see the second most, because I think it really depends where you are. And, you know, if you're looking, I would say, at either the European views on about how you go about getting hydrogen, or probably even China, it is about electrolytic hydrogen, right? Because basically they're both, you know, big gas importers, and you don't want to have a gas-based form of hydrogen coming in, because that doesn't do anything for your security of supply. So hydrogen can be really, really, you know, it has its real kind of niches in things like industrial heat. It's got a real niche probably in as well in the, you know, in renewable fuels of non-biological origins, or refinbos as they're kind of known. But I mean, those are its major niches, and that's where it's going to play this biggest role, hydrogen. And I mean, the really big thing, of course, is how do you get those costs down, you know? And yes, costs are probably going to come down as that technology matures. But at the moment, it is a real kind of economic headwind to a lot of this different types of stuff that we're looking at. And I mean, I think there, you know, I mean, you know, we've kind of lived with it for a while, but certainly the electrification of transport is, even though we've had it for quite a while, it's quite an exciting thing, right? This is a major change in how we go about, you know, maintaining mobility in, you know, in a much more sustainable way. And that's, you know, now being, you know, it's now effectively being commercialized. You know, it's the type of thing, that kind of technology breakthrough that we really need. And the other technology breakthrough we really need is something which allows you to store electricity for a much longer time than any kind of battery that we have at the moment. And that's, you know, that's going to be super important as we push more and more energy demands into you know, into the power system. And at the same time, we add huge amounts of solar, which, you know, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere, it only gives you power 6 months of the year, right? So, you know, it only really gives you anything for summer. So those kind of technologies, really exciting, even though some of them, I think, have already emerged.
Agnieszka, let me ask you the question from a slightly different angle. What low carbon energy opportunities could offer the 15% plus returns that shareholders are used to right now? I mean, what realistically, what could get to that sort of return, would you say?
Well, so I think that's everything what we have discussed, all those exciting opportunities and technology advancements and technology getting better and better. As Jan mentioned, this all comes with a premium, with a green premium that needs to be paid. And therefore, any decarbonization attempt is one that does not necessarily meet the fundamentals that will be wished for the transaction. So I won't give you one answer to your question, but the good news is that this premium will be decreasing over time, and that there will be more and more decarbonization and environmentally acceptable options that are available on the market. There will be also more and more competition among those low carbon fuels and alternatives. The expansion of hydrogen that Trevor has mentioned, we see FIDs happening, we see offtake agreements taking off, and particularly this year. So we see a large supply chain emerging and a lot of opportunity out there. So where to invest, where to focus, that's a tough question, and no one answer unless anyone on the panel has that answer. But the general takeaway is that the business fundamentals of all decarbonization choices will get better over time, and it's a shared task of the industry and the regulators who might help with that to make it happen as soon as possible. And then we'll see energy transition sharpening rather than
Where does okay, same question to you, Massimo. I'd be interested to get your views on the sorts of returns that you think could hit maybe 15%. Look,
no,
and
I
actually,
think the short answer is no, right? I mean,
right,
and that's why, you know, and that's why we've seen, you know, the IOCs, which had, you know, gone very strong before in terms of investing into some technologies, are backtracking and you know, and going back to some sort of business. That doesn't mean that they are moving away from those investments, right? But I think as they refocus on oil and gas investment, that gives you a sense of where returns are. But that's probably not the point, right? I mean, the point is about just how much governments and regulators can provide incentives for some of these investments to happen and scale up, and eventually, provide more palatable returns, right? I mean, I think again the returns of the 20-30% that oil and gas has been ensuring, the last few years are very hard to achieve, right? So it's certainly going to be, a market with lower return expectation. But then at the same time, again, if governments and regulator, put in place those incentives, eventually the demand for fossil fuel, should come down over time, and those technologies would have a bigger role also in price setting mechanism. But I also want to say a couple of other things, if I may.
Yeah, please do.
I mean, if you look at this list, actually, transport is quite exciting these days for gas, right? I mean, as you were saying, fuels for aviation and particularly for maritime are quite hard at the moment, right? And I think gas, it's a ready available solution at the moment to effectively reduce emissions. And obviously, until last year, prices of gas versus oil were quite unfavorable, and we've seen very little use of gas and LNG in maritime. But I think we're going to see over the next few years, as gas prices remain low and oil prices remain relatively high, quite a lot of uptake in terms of gas use in the maritime sector. That's not a long-term solution. I mean, clearly we need a lot of additional investment in more, in zero carbon solutions. But in the medium term, and perhaps medium to longer term, that's certainly a solution that could drive quite substantial reduction of CO2 and other pollutants associated with burning oil, and in a very cost-effective way. And then the other thing is about hydrogen, right? And certainly as Trevor was mentioning, if you look at Europe and China, certainly gas is not seen as the source to actually develop that hydrogen, for the reasons of security of supply, but also but at the same time, it's pretty obvious that producing hydrogen with gas at the moment remains far the best option economically, to do it, and in many cases also quite better. It's a better carbon footprint if you have to consider that some power used to develop hydrogen needs to come from the grid. And also it's interesting to think about markets like Japan and South Korea, which at the moment are thinking about where actually security of supply is seen in a different way, right? I mean, it's a lot about maintaining the existing infrastructure of gas and LNG imports, for example. And so some of the companies there now are thinking about producing hydrogen directly in the country. So importing LNG, for example, putting SMRs and creating a value chain of carbon capture and storage and sequestration that can eventually, maintain some of the infrastructure and use hydrogen in that way. It's certainly expensive to some other, blue hydrogen development, but it's a lot cheaper than importing hydrogen or producing hydrogen with electricity.
All right. Sorry to interrupt you, Massimo. We've got a few questions coming in from our viewers, and I want to get to those, but I've got a few other bits and pieces, plus one other polling question I want to do as well. Very quickly, Trevor, carbon capture, utilization and storage, how is that going to affect demand, would you say, overall? I know it's a big question, and it's, how long is a piece of string right now, but what are your thoughts on CCUS?
I mean, it's kind of one of these things that's going to be quite limited, right? In terms of it has one or two pretty good use cases. One of them would be in blue hydrogen, as Massimo was saying. I mean, but then you're building out you have to build out a lot of infrastructure to begin to make it work, because you need a lot of, those economies of scale in the transportation and storage of CO2. I mean, what's interesting is when we see where like a lot of the the money is being doled out in Europe, like for CCUS, under things like the Innovation Fund. Most of it's going to projects based around cement, and cement is notoriously difficult, as an industry to kind of capture and get, and decarbonize. And CCUS is probably one of the key things. When you look at the EU, I mean, they're putting out a huge role for basically, various types of, removal technologies, be it CCUS or be it, direct air capture, all of those things, to get to the 2050 role, because there are a number of areas which are really, really hard, I think, to decarbonize without it. But when you're looking at that kind of toss-up, between blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, do you build up a really big kind of, carbon capture and storage infrastructure to support that, when at the same time, probably what's going to happen is those costs of green hydrogen are going to start to come down as cost of electrolyzers come down. So really challenging. It has a role. It's reasonably expensive. You really have to have good storage. So, when you're looking at where a lot of those CCUS projects in Europe, it is around the North Sea. It's the UK, Norway, it's the Netherlands, etc. So you have to have storage. You have to have a bunch of stuff to make it work.
Okay, very quickly, I don't know if you can see that third poll question, but let's put it up if you can't. The most effective way for oil and gas companies to decarbonize their infrastructure and meet climate goals. 4 options there. For our viewers, send in your responses to that, and I'll bring those to us in just a second. Agnieszka, on the impact of carbon taxes, I don't know if this is something you want to speak to. I wonder whether you think carbon taxes are necessary to shift the economics here, so that non-fossil fuel generation becomes competitive. What are your thoughts broadly on a carbon tax?
Well, so carbon taxes are one of the regulatory measures that should help with decarbonization, and carbon taxes have been discussed quite widely as a risk factor for LNG supplies to Europe at some point. And it's one of the tools. I wouldn't really put them in any particular priority rank, and a measure that quite a few governments are looking at. And if those measures translate into legislation, then those will be the risks that will need to be considered for deliveries to a particular jurisdiction. So certainly one of the key measures, but so far they have not impeded trading in any meaningful way. But if they are in place, then they will be seen as a risk factor by the industry for sure.
And what about methane regulation?
Well, all eyes on methane regulation, because one has been adopted by the EU recently. But methane regulation is at this point all about measuring emissions and not necessarily limiting that at this stage. As soon as there will be maximum methane intensity standard in the EU, and one is expected after 2030, then the question will be, what is the consequence of not meeting that standard? Will those be only financial penalties, or will those be delivery bans on non-compliant cargoes or other commodities failing to meet that standard? So altogether, carbon taxes and any rules related to methane certification, measurement, and so on, those are matters that should be seen as a matter of regulatory risk, and this risk needs to be assessed for any transaction that's relevant to the jurisdiction where those measures are in place.
Jan, can I quickly get, as I said, I want to come to some of these questions from the audience. Can I quickly get your thoughts on the regulation piece? Again, I guess we're thinking of China versus Europe as well here.
Yeah, specific on the carbon tax or carbon pricing part, right? So actually I have an answer in 2 folds. One more general. I agree with Agnieszka said. It's carbon tax or carbon market, carbon pricing. They are one type of instrument. They put penalties basically on fossil fuel consumption and reduce their use. So it's a stick approach, and it has been proven to work, at least for decarbonizing European power sector, to driving coal to gas switching, and through economics. On the other hand, also as the EU power sector has been successfully decarbonized very quickly, when the emission reduction effort turns to industry, transport, and later building sector as well, which will be put into the carbon market. As for me, then I see that, yes, we probably increasingly need a mixed policy instrument, combining carbon pricing schemes, the stick, and subsidies, the carrot. Because, for example, to increase the uptake of green hydrogen in steel making, well, a pure carbon price will not make the business case, and you still need subsidies. And this is the same as with other decarbonization technology as well. Just small comment on China. Again, cannot emphasize enough. For example, in China, green industrial policy has been in place for quite a long time, as government step in to boost the scaling of many technologies, which China do have a dominance in some of them globally. Well, there we see that, I mean, we also talk about the 15% of return, but is the return a problem for China's SOEs? Probably not. Over the last month, there are 10 large green hydrogen projects being approved or begin to establish in China's desert in the West. Are those investment decisions based on 15% rate of return? Probably not. That's we are a government intervention deciding. That's slightly what the slight aspect where China differs from the rest of the world.
Yeah, got you. Okay, Jan. Look, we've got the excuse me, the results from that third poll, and we've talked about methane, we've talked about CCUS, and maybe it's no surprise that those come out on top. You know, the most effective way for oil and gas companies to decarbonize, meet the climate goals, reducing methane emissions at 36%, CCUS at 36% as well. Again, I guess no great surprise. Just want to come to a few questions from our audience, and then just hear some closing thoughts from you. Hitting renewable targets might be challenging. It's correct to expect LNG demand stable for the coming decades. I think we've all agreed on that. Here's a question. Along with having reliable critical material supply chain, the project's viability will also depend on the unit electricity price competitiveness. That's someone writing in with that point. I imagine you guys know better than I do on this. Trevor, that's fair to say, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as you electrify everything, then your source of energy and your energy price is going to be really, really important. But I mean, the one thing I'd point out, and you do hear it a lot, as is kind of the case for renewables, is, you know, as you get more and more renewables in the system, you're getting more and more power, which has a very low marginal cost attached to it, so almost zero. This idea of you kind of get free power. And on a wholesale market, we're already seeing periods, you know, in Germany where you get negative power pricing because you have too much solar on a Sunday afternoon and nobody wants to turn off, and you get these big negative prices. You're getting paid to use power, and people kind of say, well, you know, there's a business case there. But I think the big thing that's going to be important here is how you then start to remunerate capital that goes into power markets, right? So this big difference between what's a wholesale price for power and what's the retail price for power. You know, how is all of the capital that you're going to need to invest into grids going to be recovered? How is all of the capital that you're pouring into solar and wind going to be recovered? And so these will make that, you know, that more expensive, and there's certainly, you know, some very big price tags that are going to have to be attached to transition.
Okay, good. Look, I again, with where we are on the time, I want to get some closing thoughts from you, and really, you know, bring in, you know, anything you want to here. One of the other the questions we've had is on the deals that the EU has signed with African nations for critical minerals, whether it's lithium, cobalt, copper, et cetera, et cetera. And that clearly is going to play a role in all of this. Our title is Natural Gas: Security of Demand in a Greener World. Massimo, let me throw this out to you. How do you feel Europe has generally responded to the crisis of 2022? We've seen the shale revolution in the US. Could we see a similar shale revolution in Europe that might play a key role here?
Certainly not in gas production. No, I mean, I think the EU has been well, let's put it, more than the EU, certainly, the market has functioned well, right? I mean, the EU, it's taken some credits for it, and certainly has done good things in terms of, putting some regulation in place that have helped, reduce demand, and we've seen some, activity from governments to try and secure LNG or gas in North Africa. But I think what kind of strikes me in terms of looking back at the last few years is that certainly the market has worked well, and LNG has played an increasing important role in moving away from Asian markets and being redirected into Europe. That's something that without the role that LNG has had, without the flexibility that the US market and US LNG has brought to the global LNG market, it wouldn't have been possible, otherwise. I mean, obviously, we've paid a high price for that. Price has been extremely high as the shock has come through. But then, and certainly, we've seen places in Asia where that have struggled with those prices and demand has reduced, and we've seen blackouts. So it hasn't been, all a positive story. But certainly, after a couple of years, certainly a bit of luck with warm winters. But again, the market is showing to work and provide the right signals to balance the market, which was very strange.
Yeah. Okay. Good, Massimo. Thank you, Trevor. Let me send it to you for some closing thoughts.
Yeah. No, I think it's for the broad panel, it is that that broad agreement. I think that yes, gas has a long role to play in here. You look at fossil fuels creating the one people who really benefited from the war in Ukraine, of course, were the fossil fuel companies, because all of a sudden what they were selling was worth a whole lot more, and you got very, very high rates of return, and that's going to be very, very difficult to replicate for a long time, I think, in the transition, just because of the high cost of all of those transition things. So hopefully, I would say probably as a final thing is, the transition needs to be done. These costs need to be borne, but this isn't going to be very, this was never going to be easy. And probably the energy, crisis we lived through in the last couple of years has made it even more complicated.
Yeah. Okay. Agnieszka, what are your thoughts, especially with bearing in mind what Trevor's just said?
Yeah, so post 2022, we've seen a massive investment in infrastructure and strong contracting activity, and this is what will drive the further development of the natural gas business. The key challenge is how to implement decarbonization objective into all that, and the fact that a lot of new LNG infrastructure is constructed with transforming this infrastructure to accommodate low carbon fuels in mind. This is already a very promising sign in terms of using that infrastructure for the purpose of the energy transition. Lots of contracts are negotiated at the moment with preparation for decarbonization requirements in mind. Those contracts incorporate new rights and obligations related to emissions verification and emissions reductions. So altogether, this is a good basis for the role of gas in that new decarbonizing world.
Yeah, you agree with that, Jan?
Yes, I love any great and comprehensive summary for other panelists, and I would just say that I mean it has been a global energy crisis, right, which has left its mark on China's policy making as well. Of course, ensuring energy security and considering more import dependence, which is the factor probably affecting one of the factors affecting China's, let's say, gas imports, gas consumption policy, etc. But overall, on the energy transition pathway, I don't see a loss of steam, but I do see that policymakers globally are increasingly talk about affordability. So I think that's probably we are getting more in the near future as well. But the pathway, the direction of travel is very clear.
Yeah. Absolutely, and look, for what it's worth, my concluding thought, I think what's important here is the need to recognize both that a single-minded drive to reduce emissions as planned can help secure abundant and safe energy supply, and at the same time that a just and orderly transition requires a solid foundation of energy security. So I think both sides are very, very important. Look, I want to thank all of our speakers, Agnieszka, Massimo, Trevor, and Jan, for their input today. Sorry we had to finish so quickly. Want to thank our audience for their questions as well. Can I encourage you to fill out the post-event survey? There you go. It's that QR code on the screen to do that. It can be filled on the same event page as well. Many, many thanks. This has been a webinar again supported by the Al-Attiyah Foundation in partnership with the London Stock Exchange Group Data and Analytics. Thanks, everyone. I'm Axel Threlfall. This is Reuters.